Hey guys, tonight we're going to unravel one of the most misunderstood transitions in all of history. The shift from the dusty, brooding halls of the medieval world to the glimmering, art-soaked brilliance of the Renaissance. You're standing right in the middle of a timeline where chainmail gives way to silk doublets, where cathedral bells fade behind the soft strokes of a paintbrush on canvas, and where scholars finally begin to question everything. And guess what? You probably won't survive this, at least not with your romanticized vision of either era intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy, I'd love to know your location and local time. Drop it in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying on the straw-filled mattress of a humble stone house, flickering candlelight dancing across the uneven walls. It's the 1300s, deep into the late Middle Ages, and life is, well, heavy. Heavy in silence, heavy in labor, heavy in belief. The air is thick with the scent of hearth smoke and livestock. Your days are a pattern of repetition: plow, pray, sleep, repeat. You don't know your age exactly, and time feels like something the priests track, not you. The church looms above your life, not just in presence, but in thought. Everything revolves around it. Birth, death, guilt, forgiveness. The heavens are vast and terrifyingly mysterious, and all the answers come from men in robes with Latin tongues and dusty manuscripts locked in monasteries. Curiosity isn't rewarded. It's discouraged. In fact, asking too many questions might get you branded a heretic, or worse, a witch. You live under the watchful eye of feudal lords who own the land, and you're grateful just to use a plot of it. Your role to obey toil and tithe. It's a system held together by mutual dependency and rigid social hierarchy. God is at the top. Kings are beneath him. Then nobles, knights, and far, far below people like you. And yet even in this dim world, the gears of something new are turning. You don't know it yet, but the distant hum of change is starting to echo through the cobbled streets of Italian cities. Florence, Venice, Milan, they're becoming bustling centers of trade, ideas, and yes, wealth. While you still light your way with a candle, merchants, there are bankrolling artists to paint ceilings. Scholars are peeking back at old Greek and Roman texts once thought lost forever. And the biggest shift of all, people are daring to think for themselves. But before we jump ahead, let's keep walking through your current world. The medieval one. Outside your window or wooden slats really is a village festival. Not a grand affair, just a gathering of families, maybe with a fiddler or two, meat roasting on spits and children running barefoot through the mud. Even joy here has the earthy scent of survival. Laughter mingles with the fear of plague, famine, or war, any of which could strike at any moment, and no one would be surprised. Life is fragile and short. You've likely never seen a book, never met someone from another country, and never traveled farther than the next village over. Your worldview is narrow because it has to be. The buildings rise up not with flair, but with function. Everything is stone, timber, or thatch. Churches are grand, but only in contrast to the shabbiness of the homes. A cathedral with its Gothic arches and towering spires is a marvel that seems alien and divine. You crane your neck to look up at its stained glass windows, not to admire the art, but to feel closer to heaven. That's the medieval way. Everything points upward toward God. Your clothing is itchy and dull, made of wool, undyed and practical. Fashion as a concept doesn't really exist for your station. And even if it did, who would you dress up for? Marriage is transactional. Beauty is secondary to dowry. you probably haven't seen a mirror in months. Now fast forward in your mind, not in centuries, but in spirit. Imagine a new kind of person. One who walks upright not only with purpose, but with pride. Who speaks not just of saints and sin, but of anatomy, astronomy, architecture. A person who reads not the Bible alone, but the philosophies of Plato, the poetics of Virgil, and the sketches of Vitruvius. That person is Renaissance. And that world, it's only a few generations away. The transition will not come all at once. It will be messy, blurred. There is no single moment when the medieval clock stops ticking and the Renaissance clock begins. The two overlap like dusk and dawn, one fading as the other rises. But the contrasts are stark. In the medieval mind, the world is a fixed stage designed by God. In the Renaissance mind, the world is a stage set for man to explore, reshape, and question. In the medieval world, art is flat, symbolic, and sacred. In the Renaissance, art is dimensional, realistic, and human. In the medieval age, truth is inherited. In the Renaissance, truth is discovered. And yet you, the peasant in the 1300s, are the soil from which this bloom of change will grow. The Renaissance does not discard your world entirely. It reinterprets it, builds on it, argues with it, even reveres it in strange ways. Monks will still illuminate manuscripts even as humanists craft manifestos. Cathedrals will still rise, but now alongside domed basilicas designed with mathematical precision. As you drift to sleep in your scratchy linen under the glow of candlelight, you might dream of a different world, one where beauty is crafted for its own sake, where knowledge is a pursuit, not a threat, where the stars are charted, not feared. That world is coming, slowly, reluctantly, brilliantly, and we'll follow its rise together, one quiet breath at a time. The morning light creeps in slowly through your small window, filtered by grime and the fog of another cold, damp day. You stretch your aching limbs and listen to the familiar sounds of chickens clucking, a distant cow lowing, and someone already chopping wood. You don't own an alarm clock. Your body is the only clock you need. Time isn't a concept tracked by minutes or hours, but by bells, seasons, and hunger. This is still the medieval world, and everything around you, from your beliefs to your boots, is soaked in tradition, ritual, and repetition. But as you step outside, something odd happens. You blink, and in a flash, the scene begins to shift. The world around you doesn't just brighten, it sharpens. The houses are suddenly taller, built of stone, with more symmetry. There are glass windows, small ones, yes, but clearer than anything you've seen. A man in a doublet and hose walks past, humming an Italian melody under his breath. You're no longer in your humble medieval village, you're wandering the winding streets of Florence in the early Renaissance. And though it may still look rough by modern standards, everything feels different here. The air crackles with motion. Markets bustle. Conversations erupt in Latin, Tuscan, and French. Ideas move like currency, traded among artists, merchants, and thinkers. This is not just a place where people live. This is a place where people imagine. But let's rewind again just a bit. Back to the 12th and 13th centuries. Because the Renaissance didn't appear out of nowhere. Seeds were already being planted during the High Middle Ages. Universities began forming: Paris, Bologna, Oxford. They weren't yet the secular institutions we think of today. They were deeply rooted in theology still controlled by the church. But they marked a subtle shift. People were studying not just to worship, but to understand. Aristotle re-emerged, dusted off by Islamic scholars, and passed back into Europe. Logic, rhetoric, and natural philosophy began challenging the old order. This is where the tectonic plates of history start to grind against each other. You still live in a world where books are rare and hand-copied by monks, but you've heard a rumor, distant, unbelievable, that someone is working on a machine to print books, many at once. The name Gutenberg hasn't yet passed your ears, but his invention will change everything. When his printing press begins to churn out pages, the Renaissance will have its wings. But here's the heart of it. The Renaissance wasn't just about inventions or paintings. It was about how people saw the world. It was a philosophical rebellion, a recentering of man not as a pawn in God's vast chessboard, but as a curious thinking being placed within a grand design and given permission to question it. Imagine you're sitting in a small room lit by oil lamps watching an artist named Giotto paint a fresco. What's strange is how real it looks. The figures have depth. Faces show emotion. A tear here, a gesture there. It all feels so human. In medieval art, the Holy Trinity hovers golden and flat above stylized figures. But here in Giotto's work, God walks with man. This is the beginning of perspective, not just in painting, but in thinking. In the medieval world, God is the center. In the Renaissance, man begins to take center stage. This doesn't mean people stop believing. Far from it. Faith is still deeply rooted in everyday life. But the way people think about faith changes. The Renaissance doesn't reject religion, it reinterprets it. It adds flesh to spirit. It asks questions. It wonders how the stars move, why the heart beats, what the body looks like beneath the skin. Take a walk with me down the streets of early 15th century Florence again. You hear the clang of a hammer. It's not a blacksmith this time, but a sculptor chipping away at a block of marble. His name is Donatello. And what he's creating isn't a lifeless icon, but a boyish David with a strange smile. Something personal, emotional, earthly. That's the shift. In the Middle Ages, the world is about what's above. In the Renaissance, it becomes just as much about what's here. And that change begins to affect everything. Not just art, not just architecture, but politics, science, even how people tell time. Mechanical clocks start to appear in public squares. Time is no longer a thing whispered in monasteries. It's seen. It moves. And it belongs to the people. You back in your medieval world might hear stories of new lands being discovered. Sailors bringing tales of strange beasts and foreign peoples. Marco Polo's travels spark fantasies. Later, Columbus will cross oceans. The Renaissance fuels these ambitions, not just with ships and gold, but with the idea that there's more to know and more to control. Even language is shifting. Writers stop clinging only to Latin. They begin to write in the vernacular, the language of the people. Dante writes in Tuscan. Chaucer in Middle English. It's a quiet rebellion, but powerful. It says we no longer need to be told who we are in a dead tongue. We'll write it ourselves. The Renaissance, in essence, is a mirror turned toward humanity. And it reflects not just beauty, but contradiction. Because even as art flourishes, war and plague continue. Even as scholars question old powers, cling tighter. You can't flip a switch and end the medieval world, but you can reimagine it. And that's what the Renaissance does over decades, over centuries. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture that moment when the dark, cold hush of a medieval scriptorium gives way to the dusty, golden light of a Renaissance studio. When monks whisper prayers behind thick walls and artists sketch the anatomy of angels with ink-stained fingers, the world is still dangerous, still hard. But suddenly it feels alive. And we've only just begun. You're walking now through a town square, the kind you wouldn't have found back in your medieval village. This one is sprawling and open with neat stonework under your feet, statues in every corner, and the echo of conversation in multiple languages. A crowd is gathered not around a priest or a war horse, but a street performer reciting a poem, one written by Petrarch, perhaps whose words shimmer with emotion, not dogma. You pause. Something about the moment feels lighter, brighter. This is not a world built on fear. It's a world built on inquiry. The further you travel into the Renaissance, the more you realize that the line between it and the Middle Ages isn't a wall. It's a gradual slope. And standing halfway down that slope are people like Petrarch and Boccaccio, figures who admired the past but longed to reshape the future. Petrarch, in fact, is often called the father of humanism. And humanism is one of the Renaissance's great engines. It's the idea that studying humans, their language, their history, their passions, is not just worthwhile, it's noble. Think about that. In the Middle Ages, your worth was measured by how well you followed God's commands. In the Renaissance, your worth might also be measured by your wit, your knowledge of Roman poetry, your ability to paint a soul onto canvas. Humanism doesn't reject religion, but it expands the frame. It says, yes, there is heaven. But earth matters too. You enter a school, not a cathedral, and their chalk on slate, someone is sketching a diagram of the solar system. Not just the old geocentric model, where Earth sits like a king surrounded by spinning heavenly spheres, but a new version. One that whispers about a sun-centered system. It's dangerous knowledge, heretical even. But it's brewing. You overhear names Copernicus still murmured more than shouted. Later they'll speak louder: Galileo, Kepler, Newton. But right now it's still hush-hush, still simmering, still dangerous. Now picture a room in Florence with high windows and unfinished canvases leaning against the walls. Botticelli is painting a woman born from the sea. She's beautiful, impossibly delicate, and utterly pagan. Her name, Venus. Yes, that Venus. The old Roman goddess reborn not in marble but in oil paint. That's the Renaissance in action, reaching back into the ancient world and breathing new life into it. Where the medieval world feared classical paganism, the Renaissance world saw treasure. Scrolls, statues, scientific texts, all rediscovered, recopied, studied. And not with suspicion, but reverence. Plato and Aristotle are no longer demons in disguise. They're guides. The architecture changes too. You walk past a church with soaring Gothic arches, pointed and heaven-seeking. But just beyond it, something different catches your eye: rounded domes, clean columns, geometric harmony. It's the work of Brunelleschi, who doesn't just design with piety in mind, but with math. He revives Roman principles of balance and form. His dome for the Florence Cathedral isn't just grand, it's a marvel of engineering. It's Renaissance ambition, literalized in stone. Medieval structures were built to humble you. Renaissance structures invite you to stand in awe, but also to understand. They are sermons in symmetry. Even medicine starts to shift. In the Middle Ages, a sick body was a spiritual matter. You confessed, you prayed, you hoped. Maybe you bled a little because humors. But doctors didn't dare cut too deeply. The soul was too close. Now you sit in a Renaissance anatomy theater, and the body is no longer sacred space. It's sacred knowledge. Vesalius is writing De Humani Corporis Fabrica, the first modern anatomy text with detailed drawings. He dares to dissect, to look inside. to map the body as if it were a country to be explored. The body becomes not just a vessel of sin, but a structure complex, mechanical, and worthy of study. The change isn't universal, of course. You still pass villages clinging to superstition, still hear priests warning of damnation, still see beggars and plagues. The Renaissance doesn't erase suffering, it reframes it. It doesn't end the darkness, it just brings more candles. Let's talk literature. You crack open a dusty book, and inside are not just sermons and saints' lives, but comedy, satire, and epic tales. Boccaccio's Decameron tells stories of lust, wit, and survival during the Black Death. It laughs in the face of fear. Later, Shakespeare will write plays that blend ghosts and kings, fools, and fate. He belongs more to the later Renaissance, but his mind is forged by this world of contradiction and curiosity. And printing it explodes. Thanks to Gutenberg's press books flood the continent. Ideas spread like wildfire. A monk in Germany writes angry notes about church indulgences. His name, Martin Luther. He nails 95 theses to a church door, and suddenly reform is no longer a whisper, it's a roar. That too is Renaissance energy, not just questioning, but challenging. You sit in a tavern now, a glass of wine in your hand, and even the air feels different. Conversations swirl around you about trade, poetry, even politics. People care what you think. It's not democracy, not yet, but it's something. A spark. And yet, for all its light, the Renaissance casts long shadows. The same minds that draw the Vitruvian Man also draw maps for conquest. The same printers that distribute Erasmus and more will also print colonial charters and propaganda. Curiosity, after all, is a double-edged sword. But in this moment, this hazy, wine-soaked moment, you're just a person caught between worlds, a mind slowly waking from a long, holy sleep. The Middle Ages gave you structure. The Renaissance gives you possibility, and we still have so far to go. You find yourself in a small room once again, only this time it's neither peasant's hut nor artist's studio, it's something new. A study. Shelves lined with leather-bound books, a globe on a wooden pedestal, and a desk strewn with parchment quills and metal instruments you can't quite name. A man leans over the desk, adjusting a brass device to measure the stars. He's no priest. He's no noble. He's something different and intellectual. A thinker. A Renaissance man. And that phrase didn't exist in the medieval world. This man could be Leonardo da Vinci, or someone like him. He sketches the human form with one hand and drafts flying machines with the other. His mind is not confined to one field, it stretches across anatomy, architecture, optics, music, hydraulics. In the Middle Ages, the ideal man was a faithful servant to God and the Church. In the Renaissance, the ideal man is a polymath, a person of many talents driven by wonder, unafraid of boundaries. You're witnessing the birth of individualism. Step outside and you'll feel the difference in how people carry themselves. Not everyone is shackled to a predetermined station in life. Of course, society is still deeply hierarchical, but the doors are creaking open. A merchant can become wealthy, even powerful. A poor painter can gain fame and fortune with the right patron. It's a subtle, fragile promise that you can shape your destiny rather than inherit it. Education becomes a tool of transformation. Literacy rates climb, especially in cities. In the Middle Ages, reading was the domain of monks. In the Renaissance, it starts to belong to merchants, craftsmen, even women in noble households. Not in masses, not yet, but the shift is real. Girls are taught to read the Bible. Boys study Latin and rhetoric. And slowly, ideas seep into corners they were never meant to reach. Let's pause a moment on the status of women. Did the Renaissance lift them up? Not exactly. Women remained bound by family and church, their worth often tied to marriage and fertility. But cracks appeared in the wall. Very few women entered the conversation. Christine de Pizan wrote the Book of the City of Ladies in defense of women's intelligence and virtue. Sofonisba Anguissola became a court painter unusual not just for her gender, but for her technical mastery. And Isabella d'Este, she ruled, negotiated, collected art, and influenced politics. Her letters read like dispatches from a CEO. The medieval world taught that Eve brought sin into the world. The Renaissance didn't undo that myth, but it introduced nuance. It opened space, however small, for admiration beyond obedience. And speaking of admiration, walk with me through a gallery in Florence. The walls are crowded with paintings unlike anything you saw back in the medieval era. Here in the Renaissance, you're not just looking at saints, you're looking into their eyes. They have weight, emotion. They bleed when cut. They smile, mourn, and ache. The divine becomes human, and the human becomes beautiful. Michelangelo sculpts David not as a boy with a slingshot, but as a Greek god, tense with purpose, muscles coiled, marble turned to flesh. The sculpture doesn't whisper holiness, it shouts power, poise, and potential. And all of it was carved from a single block of discarded stone. That's Renaissance optimism for you, the belief that greatness lies within waiting to be revealed. Contrast that with the Middle Ages, where art served religion alone. Figures were stiff, symbolic, otherworldly. The message mattered more than the technique. But in the Renaissance, technique is the message. Perspective is discovered literally. Artists like Brunelleschi and Masaccio figure out how to draw three-dimensional depth on a flat surface. Suddenly, paintings aren't just illustrations. They're windows. And music, it changes too. In the medieval period, you might have heard Gregorian chants, solemn, sacred, unaccompanied. Now, in the Renaissance, music gains harmony and complexity. Polyphony weaves voices together like silk. Instruments like the lute, viola da gamba, and early harpsichord fill courts and salons with secular compositions alongside sacred ones. Music becomes entertainment, not just worship. Now look around the cityscape. There's a shift in planning. Streets are wider. Squares are deliberate. Urban space is treated with the same care as a cathedral ceiling. Public fountains, statues, loggias. These aren't just utilities. They're expressions. Cities become canvases. And at the heart of many of these transformations, patrons. In the medieval world, power and art belonged to the church. But now, wealthy banking families, especially the Medici of Florence, fund artists, philosophers, architects. They build chapels not just to glorify God, but to immortalize their name. The Renaissance is where culture and capitalism first entwine. Art isn't just a calling, it's a career. But what happens when the Renaissance leaves Italy? Because it does. And when it does, it adapts. In Northern Europe, Renaissance ideals marry with Gothic tradition. Artists like Jan van Eyck and Albrecht Dürer blend religious themes with meticulous realism. Oil paints become the tool of choice. Detail becomes obsession. You can see every thread of a robe, every reflection in a tear. The Northern Renaissance is moodier, more introspective. Less about marble bodies, more about moral complexity. And in England, the Renaissance wears a ruff and wields a quill, enter Shakespeare. The great irony is this: the Renaissance, which worshipped balance and reason, emerged in a time of chaos, plagues, wars, religious upheaval. It's a response, not a retreat, a refusal to surrender the human spirit to fear. And here you are, walking through its golden age, watching the world become curious again. You don't just see the difference between medieval and Renaissance, you feel it. One era binds you in tradition. The other invites you to explore. But we're far from done. Let's keep going. You're sitting now at a wooden table in a well-lit study parchment, before you ink-stained fingertips resting gently against your temple. A candle flickers, but this isn't the dim desperation of a medieval monk copying scripture in silence. This is a Renaissance workspace, and the parchment before you isn't a sermon, it's a question. Maybe about astronomy, maybe about the ethics of governance, maybe about the motions of the heart. And that's the heart of it, really. In the Middle Ages, knowledge was preserved. In the Renaissance, knowledge is pursued. You look out the arched window, and the street below teems with merchants, students, masons, and musicians. There's no single authority commanding them, just the rhythm of the city itself. And cities, more than castles or cathedrals, have become the heartbeat of this new age. Urbanization accelerates in the Renaissance. Florence, Venice, Rome, Antwerp, Paris. London, they don't just grow, they transform. These cities are no longer just places to survive. They're crucibles for thought, invention, and expression. Universities blossom in their centers. So do guilds, academies, salons. Where once a wandering preacher drew the crowd, now it's a poet reading verse, or a physician describing the bloodstream. You begin to notice how everything is connected. Art bleeds into science. Architecture mimics geometry. Even the economy reflects this spirit of curiosity and enterprise. Banking becomes more sophisticated. Credit and contracts replace oaths and bartering. Trade expands, and with it exposure to distant cultures. Spices, silk, sugar stories all begin to travel faster than armies. The medieval world defined itself by boundaries of nation, of class, of belief. The Renaissance begins to question those boundaries. Not to destroy them, but to test them, to see what lies beyond. And what lies beyond often is danger. You walk now through a garden. Not a wild field behind a peasant's cottage, but a carefully cultivated courtyard. Its pathways lined with herbs, fountains, and marble busts of Roman thinkers. This is a humanist garden, not just a place for flowers, but for ideas. You overhear conversations about Plato and Cicero, about virtue, about politics, about whether man is fundamentally good or corrupt. In the medieval worldview, goodness comes only from God. In the Renaissance, goodness can be cultivated through reason, education, and reflection. You pass a boy reciting Latin and a girl, yes, a girl learning music in the next room. Educating daughters is still rare, but in some elite households, it's happening. A ripple, a whisper of change. But Renaissance freedom is selective. This new world is still ruled by men, by wealth, and by bloodlines. And many still live under oppressive conditions, peasants, women, the poor. For them, the Renaissance is not a sudden sunrise. It's a slow thaw, a distant promise. Still, the shift is real. Take the idea of fame. In the medieval world, humility was a virtue. You prayed in silence. You carved anonymously for the glory of God. But now you sign your work. You seek patronage. You want your name remembered. Artists like Raphael Titian and Leonardo da Vinci don't just exist, they become icons. They're celebrated. Their personalities, their techniques, their rivalries, they all matter. The artist is no longer a faceless craftsman. He's a genius, a visionary, a Renaissance man. And that concept, the Renaissance man, begins to crystallize. It's the idea that you should strive to master multiple fields. To sculpt like Michelangelo, think like Machiavelli, experiment like Galileo, write like Montaigne. It's an ideal, of course, a bit of fantasy, but it spreads. It reshapes how people think about success, talent, and education. You sit down in a university courtyard listening to a lecture not on theology, but on classical philosophy, on Aristotle's ethics, on Socrates' questions, on Ptolemy's map of the cosmos. The walls around you are etched with Latin phrases, but the ideas being explored reach far beyond old Rome or ancient Greece. They stretch into the future. One scholar speaks of utopias. Another proposes a heliocentric universe. Another asks, should rulers be feared or loved? That last one. It comes from a new book, fresh off the press, The Prince, by Niccolo Machiavelli. And its ideas are causing quite a stir. Unlike the noble kings and warrior saints of medieval tales, Machiavelli describes rulers as pragmatic, even ruthless. Power is no longer divine. It is strategic. Political theory is born. You might feel uncomfortable with this. That's okay. The Renaissance often is uncomfortable. It peels back illusions. It challenges sacred cows. It asks whether virtue and success can coexist, or whether they must forever wrestle. And so you walk out of the courtyard into the busy street once more. A man is selling maps, freshly printed. They show the coast of Africa, the curve of the Caribbean, and something called the New World. Columbus, Vespucci, Magellan, names that represent not just voyages, but visions. The medieval world was bounded by faith and fear. The Renaissance is driven by curiosity and conquest. And therein lies its dark double. Because just as the Renaissance opens Europe's mind, it also opens Europe's hunger for land, for resources, for control. Colonialism is born not just from greed, but from this very spirit of exploration and expansion. The same hands that paint cherubs will draft treaties to divide continents. And yet for tonight, let's stay in this space between awe and unease. Let's stay in this room of books and maps where a candle still flickers beside an open window, and you ink on your fingers are beginning to see the world not as it is, but as it could be. And that is very unmedieval of you. Now you're standing in front of a massive wooden door. It's heavy, carved with images of saints and scholars, of angels and muses. You push it open and it creaks, not with age, but with authority. You've stepped into a grand library. Not a dim, cloistered monastery full of chained manuscripts, but a Renaissance repository of light, space, and ambition. Shelves stretch high. Sunlight spills across polished floors. This is a sanctuary of human thought. The medieval world guarded knowledge like treasure, locking it behind walls of Latin vellum and strict hierarchy. The Renaissance begins to unleash it, to translate it, to duplicate it, to share it. You run your fingers along the spines of books, Cicero, Hippocrates, Euclid. Next to them, Dante, Petrarch, Erasmus. A holy text still sits in a place of honor, but it no longer stands alone. It's joined by treatises, dialogues, manifestos, all printed, all portable. The invention of the printing press by Gutenberg didn't just produce books, it produced revolutions. Knowledge becomes a commodity. Ideas no longer belong only to monks, scholars, or kings. They travel through trade routes across borders into homes. A Renaissance reader can explore the heavens, read a Roman satire, and study geometry all in the same afternoon. And because knowledge spreads faster, change spreads faster too. You see it in religion first. The church, which dominated the medieval landscape like an unmovable mountain, begins to feel tremors. It had been the sole interpreter of divine will, the single thread between heaven and earth. But now people start asking, what if we read the Bible ourselves? What if we disagree with the priests? This is where the Renaissance collides with the Reformation. You're in Wittenberg, 1517. Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church door. The act is bold, but what matters more is that it's printed. Thousands of copies flood the continent. It's not just a protest, it's a spark. Soon John Calvin will follow. So will Zwingli. The unity of Christendom begins to crack, and ordinary people, start debating faith openly. The Renaissance didn't cause the Reformation, but it armed it. And not just with print, but with thought. Humanism taught people to question, to reason, to value the individual conscience. So when the church sells indulgences, people don't just grumble, they ask why. When the Pope claims divine authority, thinkers reply with scripture logic and counter-authority. Suddenly religion isn't a single voice, it's a chorus, or a cacophony, depending on who you ask. This would have been unthinkable in the High Middle Ages. Heresy was death. But now debate is dangerous, yes, but possible. And that possibility spreads into other realms. Step into a court of law. The Renaissance legal mind begins to shift from judgment by ordeal or religious decree to reasoned argument, precedent, and codified law. Governance is still often arbitrary, but the foundations of civic order, of rights, contracts, citizenship begin to form. Look at the city-states of Italy, Florence, Venice, Genoa. Each is a living experiment in balance between oligarchy and democracy, trade and war, church and state. In Venice, you might hear the word republic. It doesn't mean what it means today, but it's a beginning. The idea that power can be managed, not inherited alone. Even the economy is transforming. In medieval times, wealth was land, ownership of soil, peasants' livestock. In the Renaissance, wealth becomes fluid. It moves through trade, finance, currency. Banking families like the Medicis wield influence not because of their titles, but because of their books, ledger books. Double-entry bookkeeping changes how people calculate, invest, and build. This new economic logic supports exploration, art, and science. Patronage isn't just generosity, it's investment. And that brings us to the Renaissance artist once again. Imagine you're standing behind Leonardo da Vinci as he mixes pigment for a new canvas. His notebooks are open beside him, filled with sketches of helicopters, anatomical dissections, canal systems. You watch his mind jump from page to palette. He isn't just making something beautiful, he's making something true. That's one of the defining traits of Renaissance art. It seeks truth in form. Not spiritual truth alone, but physical, geometric, and emotional truth. Proportions matter. Light and shadow matter. How a knee bends, how an eye glistens, these are studied, not guessed. And beyond Leonardo, you see others. Raphael with his serene Madonnas. Titian with his bold, fleshy mythologies. Caravaggio with his violent realism and deep shadows. Each one different, yet all grounded in the Renaissance belief that art can reveal reality. Now step across a threshold into a home. Not a castle, not a hut, a townhouse. Comfortable, multi-storied, furnished with rugs, paintings, books. The idea of interior space changes in the Renaissance. Homes become reflections of the self, not just shelters. People collect things not just for use, but for joy. Cabinets of curiosity emerge. Display cases filled with shells, skulls, coins, oddities from distant lands. They're not just trophies. They're stories. You begin to see yourself differently, too. In the medieval world, identity was communal. You belonged to your village, your parish, your lord. In the Renaissance, identity becomes more internal. You consider yourself. You reflect. You journal. You paint your own portrait. Individuality, however fragile or flawed, takes root. It won't bloom fully for centuries, but it begins here. And so you close the book in your lap. You look out the library window again. It's night now. The stars above are no longer just signs of fate. They're spheres in motion, points on a chart, a universe unfolding. And you are no longer a small, voiceless figure beneath them. You are a question asker, a map drawer, a possibility. That above all is the difference. In the medieval world, the path was set. In the Renaissance, the road forks. The world doesn't just exist, it invites. And you've just begun to accept. You wake to the soft tolling of bells, not the ominous clang of a medieval cathedral summoning souls to confession, but the calm rhythm of a Renaissance city marking the hour. Time is measured now, not just felt. You stretch beneath linen sheets and rise into a room that's no longer just shelter. It's a chamber of thought. A lute leans in the corner. A mirror catches morning light. A book sits open on a desk left there the night before, not sacred scripture, but a volume of Montaigne's essays. You read a passage where he muses about himself, his doubts, his pleasures, his contradictions. It's astonishing. Not because the ideas are so new, but because the author dares to center himself. This is a man writing not for approval, but for understanding. That is the Renaissance ethos, introspection, as a form of exploration. And this self-awareness doesn't live only in books. It shows up in how people dress, how they decorate their homes, how they write letters and pose for portraits. The self becomes a subject worthy of study, depiction, and reflection. The medieval mind asked, "How can I serve God?" The Renaissance mind adds, "Who am I, and how can I better understand my place in this world?" That question even finds its way into politics. You step into the palace of a prince, not a king by divine right, but a ruler shaped by the Renaissance. He consults maps, not just for territory, but for strategy. He hires artists, scholars, engineers. He reads Machiavelli. He knows that power isn't granted by heaven alone. It must be earned, kept, and sometimes feared. Politics becomes a chess game, one that values perception, alliances, and image. Across Europe, you begin to see these Renaissance rulers emerge: Cosimo de' Medici, in Florence, Francis I in France, Elizabeth I in England. They wear crowns, yes, but they also collect paintings, sponsor scholars, and correspond with thinkers. Their courts become cultural hubs where politics and philosophy mingle. Now turn to the theater. You sit down on a wooden bench in a packed playhouse in London. The air is full of the scent of ale, sweat, and anticipation. The curtain rises, and then Shakespeare. A man steps forward and delivers a soliloquy so rich, so complex, that you forget he's playing a part. Hamlet wonders whether to be or not to be, and the crowd feels it. Because here on this stage, human doubt has become drama. In the medieval mystery plays, characters were archetypes: virtue, vice, death, sin. In the Renaissance theater, they become people, torn, proud, grieving, passionate. The stage becomes a mirror to the mind. Literature evolves too. Language blooms into something lush, expressive, and personal. Poetry moves from Latin to the vernacular. You hear sonnets in Italian, essays in French, and blank verse in English. Writers don't just report the world, they shape it. And all this expression travels faster now. The printing press doesn't just duplicate texts, it democratizes ideas. A book printed in Venice finds its way to Paris. A pamphlet from Wittenberg shows up in Zurich. A poem from London is read in Edinburgh. And suddenly Europe isn't a patchwork of isolated cultures, it's a network. But not everyone likes this. You overhear a preacher warning about the dangers of books of secular art, of vanity. The Renaissance unleashes knowledge, but it also unleashes anxiety. The more people think, the more they challenge. And the more they challenge, the more some wish to tighten control. That's the paradox of the Renaissance. It frees minds, and in doing so, it provokes backlash. In Florence, the fiery monk Savonarola rails against worldly excess. He organizes a bonfire of the vanities where citizens toss paintings, jewelry, even books into the flames. For a moment, the city turns against its own spirit. But that moment passes. Savonarola is hanged, and the fires are replaced by frescoes once again. The Renaissance survives because it is resilient. It doesn't need permission. It adapts. You visit a workshop and meet a young woman learning to illuminate manuscripts. Her teacher sees her talent, gives her tools, and encourages her. That wouldn't have happened in many parts of medieval Europe. Now it's still rare, but it happens. The cracks in the old walls are growing wider. Even in science, the Renaissance refuses to be still. You watch a young man drop different weights from a tower. He's testing gravity, not relying on Aristotle, but observing reality. He scribbles notes. He sketches diagrams. He does something radical. He trusts his senses. That young man might be Galileo. He'll spend his life challenging orthodoxy, peering through telescopes and landing in trouble with the church. But his method, hypothesis, observation, conclusion will change the world. This scientific spirit is part of the Renaissance fabric. You feel it in anatomy theaters where students dissect corpses to learn the body. You see it in botanists cataloging plants, in astronomers charting the stars. It's a revolution not of belief, but of method. Even the calendar shifts. You hear of a new one commissioned by Pope Gregory XIII, meant to correct errors in timekeeping. The Gregorian calendar begins to replace the Julian one. Even time is being rethought. The medieval worldview believed in eternity. The Renaissance worldview measures time, charts it, slices it into hours, minutes, seconds. And that precision matters. You've traveled far in just a few years of history. From the rigid, often dark contours of the Middle Ages to the luminous, shifting landscape of the Renaissance. You're no longer a shadow in someone else's story. You are a participant, a reader, a thinker, a soul in motion. And the road ahead, it only gets more complex and more brilliant. Let's keep going. You're walking along a harbor now where sails stretch against the wind and ships creak as they load goods, silks, spices, sugar, and strange cargoes from lands you've only just begun to imagine. The air smells of salt sweat and something else, opportunity. This is no longer the closed world of medieval manors and narrow fields. This is the wide, unknowable world of discovery. The Renaissance didn't just open minds, it opened oceans. And with the ocean came a new kind of man, the explorer. Step aboard one of these ships and you'll feel it immediately, the mix of bravery and ambition, the thrill and the dread. You might hear the names Columbus, Vespucci, Magellan, Cabot. These aren't knights in armor. They're navigators, merchants, gamblers. They don't ride for God and King alone. They sail for gold, for glory, for the sheer possibility of elsewhere. In the medieval world, the map ended at the known. Dragons guarded the edge. In the Renaissance, the maps start to change. Each journey redraws borders. Each voyage brings a new coast into focus. Cartographers update the outlines. Suddenly, Europe is not the center, it's a corner. But these discoveries aren't just geographic, they're cultural. For the first time, Europeans encounter civilizations completely unfamiliar. The empires of the Aztecs, the Inca, the kingdoms of West Africa, the trading ports of India, the cities of East Asia. They react with awe, with confusion, with greed. Some wish to learn, others to conquer. This too is the Renaissance expansion, exploitation, and exchange. A time of marvels, but also moral fractures. You pause at a market stall and see goods from across the globe: Turkish coffee, African ivory, Chinese porcelain. Ideas begin to travel along with objects. Algebra comes westward. So do astrolabes and medical texts preserved by Islamic scholars. The Renaissance thrives not because it was born from nothing, but because it absorbed so much. And yet back home the tension rises. The very curiosity that feeds the Renaissance also challenges power. The Church, once the great anchor of medieval certainty, begins to lose its grip. Protestant reformers denounce its corruption. Catholic authorities tighten their hold. The Counter-Reformation surges, and with it come new inquisitions, new censors, new walls built against heresy. You enter a bookshop, and beneath the counter, the printer shows you a list, not of titles for sale, but of books forbidden. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum. It grows longer every year. And still, people read. They read Erasmus, who calls for reason and moderation. They read Rabelais, who laughs and pokes fun. They read Machiavelli, who strips the veil from politics. And they read Copernicus, who dares to move the earth itself out of the center of creation. You hold that last book in your hands. De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. It looks innocent enough. But it shifts the sky. In the medieval cosmos, Earth was the still center of God's masterpiece. In Copernicus's version, Earth moves, not randomly, but with elegant precision around the sun. It's terrifying. It's liberating. It's blasphemous. And it's true. The implications echo beyond astronomy. If the Earth is not central, then maybe mankind isn't either. Maybe the universe isn't a stage set just for us. Maybe we are small, curious, fallible, capable of error. And in the Renaissance era isn't the end, it's the beginning of inquiry. You cross a university courtyard and the buzz is palpable. Students argue about Aristotle, about Ptolemy, about Plato and Augustine. Professors write in the margins not to worship the ancients, but to challenge them. That's the great shift. In the medieval world, old wisdom was law. In the Renaissance, old wisdom becomes dialogue. You walk past an artist's studio, brushes in cups, sketches pinned to the wall. The model in the center isn't a saint or a noble. She's a fruit vendor, barefoot, wrinkled, real. And she's being painted with the same dignity once reserved for Madonnas and martyrs. That's the Renaissance eye to see beauty not only in ideals, but in imperfection. And while Renaissance art reaches for harmony and symmetry, it also begins to explore contrast. In Venice, Tintoretto bathes his canvases in drama. In Spain, El Greco stretches figures into otherworldly shapes. Even as artists pursue realism, they discover emotion, mood, and tension. Art is no longer just depiction, it's interpretation. You stop in front of a mirror. There you are, hair, wine-tousled eyes reflecting torchlight. You recognize yourself, but also see something new, a flicker of thought behind the gaze. Not just who you are, but what you might become. And that is the Renaissance gift. It hands you the tools to ask, what is man? What is truth? What lies beyond the stars? what lives inside the heart. Not everyone will answer well. Some will exploit. Some will silence. But the questions are there now. Open, inviting, waiting. And as you turn away from the mirror, you realize something the medieval world told you who you were. The Renaissance asks you to find out. So keep walking. There's still more to discover. You find yourself climbing the steps of a grand observatory perched above a Renaissance city. The sky above is ink black and spattered with stars, and tonight those stars are not just symbols, they're subjects. Inside, a man is adjusting a polished brass telescope, its lenses ground by hand, its angles precise. He's charting the heavens, but his gaze is no longer reverent. It's investigative. This is Galileo's world now. The Renaissance has reached the point where even the cosmos can no longer remain untouched by human curiosity. It's no longer enough to recite the names of constellations passed down from antiquity. The time has come to measure them, track them, prove them. Science, long shackled to theology, is beginning to walk on its own. You stand beside the astronomer watching as he sketches the surface of the moon. He does not see perfection. He sees craters. He sees shadows. The moon, once a flawless sphere in the medieval imagination, becomes a landscape. And with that small observation, a wall begins to crumble. It's the wall between the divine and the material. In the medieval cosmos, there was earth below, corrupt and fleeting, and heaven above, perfect and eternal. But now maybe the heavens are made of the same stuff. Maybe the rules that govern earth also govern the stars. And if that's true, then anything can be understood. Anything can be questioned. This isn't just theory, it's revolution. You leave the observatory and walk through a printing house just as a batch of pages comes rolling off the press. The ink is fresh, the ideas even fresher. Diagrams, equations, arguments, names like Copernicus, Vesalius, and Galileo pass between hands. These books are not just for the elite. They're being bought by doctors, navigators, teachers. Knowledge is no longer chained to cathedrals, it's loose in the streets. But not everyone is pleased. You hear footsteps on cobblestones, papal envoys whispering warnings. For every idea that breaks through, there's a backlash. Galileo's telescope may reach the stars, but the Inquisition brings him back to Earth, demanding silence, obedience, repentance. He famously recants, but as legend has it, he mutters under his breath, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. That's the Renaissance spirit in one sentence, cornered, punished, but undeterred. Now step into a painter's studio, not the orderly space of Raphael or Botticelli, but something messier, darker. This is the Baroque beginning to stir, born from Renaissance roots but growing bolder. Caravaggio's work is here, half-finished on the wall. Stark lighting, raw expressions, sinners painted with divine intensity. He's not illustrating the saints, he's embodying them. You stare into the eyes of a figure on the canvas, a common man portrayed with such intensity you can't look away. It's sacred, yes, but human first. This is the Renaissance moving into new emotional terrain. Less about balance, more about drama. Less about form, more about feeling. Outside, cities swell with this energy. Buildings rise with mathematical precision. Streets are paved with pride. Palaces gleam with frescoes. There is wealth here now, visible, tangible. And with that wealth comes another Renaissance invention status. In the medieval world, you were born into a role, a serf, a knight, a bishop. In the Renaissance, wealth lets you buy your place. A merchant in Venice can live like a duke. A banker in Florence can influence papal elections. It's not exactly equality, but it's mobility. And that's new. You walk into a banquet hall where music is playing not just a single flute or chant, but layered harmonies composed for the occasion. Instruments you've never seen are being tuned: viols, clavichords, sackbuts. Music has become a profession. Composers like Palestrina and Josquin des Prez write complex pieces not just for worship, but for courtly joy. Music is now math and feeling precision and performance. And somewhere across the sea in England, a woman wears a crown. Queen Elizabeth I rules not by accident, but by command. She reads Latin. She writes speeches. She sponsors explorers and playwrights. Her reign is a renaissance in miniature, glittering, dangerous, cultured, self-aware. The fact that a woman can reign alone and unwed is a statement. Not that the Renaissance has solved gender inequality, but it has cracked the door. You wander now through a scholar's study in France. A man named Montaigne is writing about himself. Not events, not kings, not saints. Himself, his fears, his thoughts, his cat, his indigestion. This is the essay, a new form of literature. Personal, reflective, honest. And again, you realize the Renaissance doesn't just change the world outside, it changes the world within. Introspection was not a medieval habit. Life was too brutal, too prescribed. But now you can ask, what do I believe? What do I feel? What do I want? You hold a mirror again, not to admire, but to wonder. What is this thing we call the self? Is it shaped by stars, by blood, by books? The Renaissance doesn't give you answers. It gives you permission. So as you return to your quiet chamber, candle in hand, you hear the sounds of a world wide awake. A printing press clanking, a lute string plucked, a painter arguing about shadows, a child reciting lines from Ovid. None of this existed like this before. The medieval world built the walls. The Renaissance paints the doors and dares you to walk through. And you're already halfway there. Let's keep going. You step into a courtyard bathed in morning light, birds rustling in vines that wind their way up weathered stone. This isn't a palace or cathedral, just a private garden in a Renaissance home. Yet everything about it speaks to the new age. The symmetry of the hedges, the marble bust of a Roman philosopher nestled beneath a fig tree, the carefully arranged stones that guide your steps, not by chance, but by design. Even the way nature is curated here reveals a truth. The Renaissance isn't just about what's out there, it's about shaping the world in here too. This quiet garden whispers something radical. The world is knowable, understandable, organizable. And perhaps most powerfully, it is yours to engage with. You settle onto a carved bench, watching a pair of students walking past with scrolls and lively voices. One argues for the Stoics, the other quotes Cicero. These are not dusty debates, they're personal, urgent, relevant. The ancients are not relics, they are colleagues. The Renaissance doesn't worship them. It converses with them. You pull from your satchel a small leather-bound volume, a translation of the Republic. Not in Greek, not in Latin, in Italian, accessible, fluid. This is another Renaissance shift, the movement of knowledge downward, outward, into the hands of anyone willing to read, reflect, and wrestle with big ideas. And yet, the more minds open, the more friction arises. This century, the 1500s, is an age of contradiction, art and warfare, exploration and exploitation, inquiry and oppression. The Renaissance produces Da Vinci and the Spanish Inquisition. It produces Erasmus and Henry VIII. It sketches the Vitruvian Man and drafts colonial blueprints. You stand before a world at the height of its confidence and its blindness. Take architecture, for instance. In Rome, you watch as workers rebuild ancient ruins into Renaissance palaces. Bramante constructs airy churches where light seems to float. Michelangelo reimagines St. Peter's Basilica. Every column, every dome declares human order within divine space. And yet beneath that beauty lies tension. Who pays for it? Who labors for it? Whose truth does it serve? Renaissance cities dazzle the eye but tighten social divisions. Art becomes propaganda. Portraits become declarations of power. Patronage often masks control. And yet again, the brilliance remains. In a merchant's home in Antwerp, you examine a painting by Jan van Eyck. Every thread of a tapestry, every gleam of light on a goblet. He paints reality, not as a backdrop to faith, but as a subject in itself. In his work, a common room becomes sacred through sheer attention. That's what Renaissance art does. It dignifies the world. Not just the noble, not just the saint. Everything. A fruit stand, a mother, a muddy road, a man at rest. This is a profound shift. The world is no longer just the stage for divine drama. It is the drama. You walk the same streets as the people who made these changes. Artists, scholars, merchants, explorers, radicals, and it begins to dawn on you. The Renaissance wasn't a clean break. It was a reawakening, a return to something long buried, a rereading of ancient pages with modern eyes, and more importantly, a realization that human beings can be more. More curious, more creative, more complicated. Back in your room, you open a letter. It's written by a friend studying in England, marveling at the changes their grammar schools, opening new plays being staged in public theaters, even women beginning to write under pseudonyms. Your friend signs off with a quote from Sir Thomas More's Utopia, a place that doesn't exist, but maybe could. That's another Renaissance invention, imagination, as a tool for reform. Medieval thinkers rarely indulged in political fantasy. The world was as God made it, immutable, hierarchical. The Renaissance says, what if it could be better? What if kings were wise? What if education was universal? What if justice was possible? These questions sound tame to you now, but then they were incendiary. And yet the Renaissance is no naive dream. You're reminded of this when you pass a scaffold in the city square. A man is being executed for heresy, not because he stole or murdered, but because he thought too much. Even in this era of light, there are shadows. The thinkers are still watched. The press is still censored. The artists still judged. But the difference now, the ideas survive. Because they're written, printed, reprinted, memorized, whispered, translated, taught. They slip past walls. They cross borders. They outlast the flames. And you, the humble observer in this time-traveling walk, begin to feel something unusual, a kind of weightlessness. You are no longer tethered by the old constraints of medieval certainty. You are being lifted quietly, steadily, by the Renaissance's central promise you can know more than you were told. And as the day fades, you return to that garden, to that bench, and you look up. The stars are still there, but now they aren't distant signs of fate. They're destinations. Let's keep walking. The Renaissance has more to teach. You're drifting now through the grand hall of a Renaissance palace, where the ceiling soars like the sky, and every inch of wall space bursts with color, motion, and meaning. Murals of gods and mortals swirl overhead, not in service of dogma, but of story, expression, even sensuality. This is not the medieval world, where art pointed solely to heaven. This is the Renaissance, where art points everywhere upward, outward, inward. In one corner, a philosopher gestures toward a scroll. In another, a noblewoman stands poised in fine silk, her gaze meeting yours with quiet intelligence. You're surrounded by human beings, rendered not just realistically, but reverently. And that's the quiet revolution of the Renaissance: reverence for the human. This reverence didn't arise overnight. You trace its roots back to those first humanist scholars who copied Cicero and reread Seneca, not out of nostalgia, but out of deep hunger to understand human nature, not simply to escape it. From that hunger grew the whole banquet of Renaissance culture. And now you're tasting every course. You walk past a library shelf holding translations of Plato, once banned, now printed. Next to them, a medical text with diagrams of the human body, no longer speculative, but observed. You even find a weathered volume of Boccaccio's Decameron, its stories full of wit, pleasure, grief, and longing. These are not tales to scare you into virtue. They are tales to remind you that life is rich, strange, unpredictable, and worth writing about. Step outside and you're greeted by voices not from a pulpit, but from a plaza. The people gathered here aren't attending mass. They're debating, laughing, trading ideas. A wandering actor performs a satire in the center. A schoolmaster explains geometry to a group of children. The air itself seems more alive, as if language has turned electric. This is civic culture, a concept alien to most of the Middle Ages. Back then, power radiated from the throne or the altar. But now power begins to ripple through the city square. From patrons to poets, from merchants to musicians, people realize we shape the world around us. You stroll past a printer's shop and watch a young apprentice load plates into the press. Sheets of paper fly out like wings: philosophical essays, political pamphlets, travelogues. There's something almost miraculous about it. These aren't messages from God or kings. These are the thoughts of men now multiplied, now unstoppable. Among them, a new voice rises: Nicholas Copernicus, proposing a sun-centered cosmos. You recognize his diagrams from earlier. They were radical then. Now they're being discussed in classrooms, at dinner tables, in letters exchanged between cities. The Renaissance doesn't just produce knowledge, it normalizes it. That's a sea change. In the medieval mindset, change was suspect. Innovation was often feared, associated with heresy or instability. In the Renaissance, change becomes fashionable. You see it in clothing shifting from stiff brocade to fluid velvet. You hear it in music evolving from chant into polyphony and madrigal. You feel it in philosophy, no longer confined to theology, but sprawling into ethics, statecraft, aesthetics. And while much of this takes place among the elite, its ripple effects reach farther than you'd expect. A miller's son in Germany reads a printed Bible for the first time. A merchant's daughter in the Low Countries learns to paint miniatures. A sailor, illiterate but curious, brings home tales from across the Atlantic. The world is no longer just something to endure. It is something to encounter. You find yourself aboard a small vessel now docked at a bustling port. You're not in Florence or London anymore. You're somewhere foreign. Lisbon, maybe, or Antwerp. There are maps everywhere, spilling off tables pinned to walls, half correct and wildly hopeful. The Renaissance has discovered the planet, and it cannot help but redraw it. But there's another shift underfoot. Time itself begins to feel different. In the Middle Ages, time was circular, marked by bells, seasons, feast days. Now, time is linear. There's a past to study, a present to live, a future to imagine. You see this in how people write letters, journals, histories. The individual story becomes a thread in the larger fabric. Your birth, your work, your death, they matter not just to your soul's salvation, but to the record. History becomes a subject. Memory becomes an art. The self becomes worth recording. And so in a small chamber you watch someone write not about saints or kings, but about himself. The light through the window is soft. The page is blank. The thoughts are tangled, but they begin to unspool. This man isn't trying to convert or condemn. He's just thinking on paper that someone might be Montaigne, or it might be you. Because this too is the Renaissance's gift, not just to history, but to you. The permission to ask, to reflect, to become. You don't have to wait for divine instruction or noble birth. You don't have to live by old scripts. You can write your own. And that is the ultimate departure from the medieval world. You were once a cog in a divine machine. Now you're a voice in a growing chorus. Unique, imperfect, glorious. The stars above you still shimmer. The books still whisper. The canvases still dry in sunlit rooms. But now they're calling to you by name. Let's keep going. The Renaissance still has more to reveal. You're in motion again, wandering through the dim corridors of a Renaissance university just before dawn. The lamps along the stone walls flicker with golden light, throwing long shadows that stretch across the floor like reaching fingers of time. Students drift past in cloaks, their arms filled with books, their eyes alive with fatigue and inspiration. This isn't a place of rote memorization anymore. It's a place where minds collide. The air hums with disagreement, healthy disagreement. You hear debates about Aristotle's logic, about the ethics of empire, about the true nature of the soul. Here, truth isn't just handed down. It's negotiated, challenged, sharpened by friction. And that's the pulse of the Renaissance thought, as an active force. You pause outside a lecture hall and peek in. A professor is pacing slowly beneath a vaulted ceiling, quoting not the Bible but Cicero. His lecture is about rhetoric, not just how to speak, but how to persuade. How to shape opinion, command attention, win trust. This isn't simply a tool of scholarship, it's a tool of power. Because now in this age, words matter more than ever. You stroll through the university's courtyard, stepping over puddles left by an early rain. A group of students gathers near the steps, their Latin fading into laughter. Their discussion has wandered from Plato to poetry to politics. They aren't just studying, they're forming. Their sense of self, of society, of possibility. These students are tomorrow's statesmen, scientists, artists. And though they don't know it, they are carriers of a cultural virus, a thirst that spreads wherever curiosity can take root. And curiosity is spreading fast. Travel is no longer the privilege of the nobility alone. Merchants crisscross Europe with goods and gossip. Young scholars travel to study under famous masters. Painters move from court to court. Architects carry blueprints across borders. With every journey, the Renaissance becomes more interconnected. You arrive in a port city, Genoa perhaps, or Seville, and step into a workshop where men are building a ship, not for war, but for knowledge. On the wall hangs a chart of stars and wind patterns. This isn't conquest for its own sake. It's exploration, calculation, mapping the unknown. You can feel the age pressing against its boundaries. At the docks, a boy listens to a sailor describe a place beyond the horizon, where plants look alien and gold lies in the riverbeds. Whether the tale is true or exaggerated hardly matters. The boy's imagination is ignited, and in that spark, the Renaissance continues. You walk through an apothecary's shop now, where jars line the walls labeled with names in Greek, Arabic, and Latin. This is another Renaissance gift synthesis. Rather than destroy what came before, this age gathers it, Greek philosophy, Roman law, Islamic science, Jewish scholarship, and mixes it into something new. Medicine, for example, begins to shift from mysticism to method. Physicians debate anatomy, circulation, contagion. They keep casebooks. They publish treatises. And while they don't yet have microscopes or antiseptics, they observe. They measure. They question. Slowly, the body becomes less a mystery and more a system. In a narrow alleyway, you hear a harpsichord drifting from an open window. You follow the sound and find yourself in a music room where a young woman practices scales. Her instructor, serious and kind, adjusts her posture. The girl returns to her instrument with determination. This is not a scene you'd find in many corners of the medieval world. But now in more cities, more homes, more lives, art is accessible. Music isn't just for monasteries and kings. It's for drawing rooms, for theaters, for the rising middle class. Sheet music circulates. Composers are named. Songs are performed not only for praise, but for pleasure. You pass by a tailor's shop. Dresses and doublets hang in the window, cut in new styles. Fashion is no longer solely about rank, it's about expression. Even clothing starts to say, "This is who I am." Identity once fixed by birth begins to acquire layers. And the printing press continues its quiet revolution. You step into a bookseller's stall and find something remarkable, a guide to manners. Instructions on how to walk, eat, speak, present oneself in polite company. Not just for nobility, for anyone who wishes to rise. This is the democratization of refinement. The Renaissance doesn't just open minds, it teaches people how to shape themselves. The very idea of self-improvement is born here. You sit in a candlelit room later that evening reflecting on the breadth of it all. How this age doesn't reject religion, but it allows room for philosophy. How it doesn't abolish hierarchy, but it plants the seed of merit. How it doesn't promise paradise, but it suggests that paradise might be built one painting, one thought, one idea at a time. You're watching a world learn to breathe differently. Not in gasps of fear, but in slow, measured, intentional inhales. Even death changes meaning. In the medieval world, it was a threshold, terrifying, holy final. In the Renaissance, death becomes a subject of art. Memento mori paintings remind viewers that life is fleeting, but they also whisper, "Make it count." Legacy becomes tangible. Not only in tombs and titles, but in pages, pigments, architecture, impact. You understand now the Renaissance wasn't just a time, it was a mode of being. A way of seeing the world as changeable, expansive, layered. And yourself, not just a servant or soul, but a maker. Of choices, of thoughts, of meaning. The journey's not over yet. There's still more to unfold. Let's continue. You now find yourself standing in front of a painting, one so vast and alive, it seems to pulse. The figures on it are familiar philosophers, artists, mathematicians. But they aren't dressed in robes of pure antiquity. Are they garbed in the somber hues of saints? They wear Renaissance fashion, flowing elegant, assertive. The painter, Raphael, and the work, the School of Athens. This masterpiece, painted on the wall of a Vatican chamber, captures the essence of the Renaissance in a single moment. It's a visual manifesto. In it, Plato points to the heavens while Aristotle gestures to the earth. Around them, Pythagoras, Euclid, Zoroaster, and hidden among the ancients, Raphael himself. Even art has joined the philosophical debate. This is the Renaissance at its most self-aware. It reveres the past while boldly inserting itself into it. It says, "We belong in this conversation." You turn away from the painting and walk out into the piazza. Rome's streets teem with life priests, pilgrims, merchants, artists, children. Overhead church bells chime beside scaffolding, where Michelangelo toils on the Sistine Chapel. He's not just decorating a ceiling, he's redefining it. God and Adam reach toward each other, not with fear, but with touch. Divine and human face to face. Equal, almost. This is theological tension painted in flesh and muscle. You step into a print shop on a side street where young apprentices ink plates and press them onto parchment. One sheet catches your eye. It's not a religious tract or philosophical essay, it's a political cartoon. Satirical, sharp, funny. The Renaissance has learned to laugh, to criticize, to mock. This is a dangerous power, but a liberating one. Humor becomes another way to question the world. Satire, once confined to taverns and whispers, now travels by paper. As you walk through a crowded market, the languages around you mingle: Italian, Spanish, French, Flemish. The Renaissance has ceased to be an Italian secret. It has swept across the Alps, across the Channel, into every corner of Europe. In France, François Rabelais writes ribald intellectual tales that challenge church and crown alike. In the Netherlands, Erasmus pens works of reform wit and scholarship. In England, a playwright named William Shakespeare has begun staging stories that fuse the tragic and the comic, the historical and the human. His characters think, they soliloquize, they doubt, they change. And that's the key. The Renaissance world is no longer still. It's in motion. You pass through a schoolroom where children read aloud from printed texts. No longer chained to Latin, their books speak in the vernacular. Learning is becoming local, personal. They read sonnets and fables. They memorize speeches. They feel the words as tools and weapons and gifts. And while you might still see a knight in armor ride by, he is now part of the old world nostalgic ceremonial. The real power lies elsewhere. You climb the stairs to a city council chamber. It's sparse but orderly. Men in plain robes sit in discussion not on divine authority, but civic responsibility. The very idea of republican governance, the notion that leaders are chosen, that decisions must be debated, that a city belongs to its people, has grown stronger. Venice has perfected it. Florence has fought for it. Others now imitate it. The Renaissance gives birth not only to art and knowledge, but to civic identity. It asks, what does it mean to belong, to participate, to take part in shaping the world, not just enduring it? And alongside these lofty conversations, the practical world evolves too. You enter a merchant's office where ledgers line the walls and contracts are being signed. Banking is no longer just a matter of lending and interest. It's a science. Account books are mathematical. Credit is calculable. Even risk is being studied. This is proto-capitalism, messy, exciting, ruthless. The Renaissance worldview has unlocked more than beauty. It has unleashed competition, speculation, ambition. Not all of it noble, but all of it alive. Later, you rest in the shade of a courtyard listening to a conversation between two travelers. They trade tales of new continents, of spices and slaves, of missionaries and maps. And here again, the contradiction returns. For every work of wonder the Renaissance produces, there's a shadow behind it. For every palace, a colony. For every innovation, a cost. Humanism has its limits. Curiosity often outruns conscience. And yet the age presses forward. As night falls, you find yourself in a study, A globe glows in the candlelight. A quill rests beside an unfinished letter. The room is silent except for the sound of your breath, slow and thoughtful. You realize now the Renaissance is not a destination. It is a transition, a passage from one way of thinking to another. It doesn't abandon faith, but it refuses to be ruled by fear. It doesn't deny tradition, but it dares to reshape it. It is a bridge between the known and the unknown, between a world of unquestioned answers and a world that thrives on asking. And tomorrow, you'll cross that bridge once more. There's still more to see. Let's go. You rise early, stepping into a narrow cobblestone lane just as the sun catches the edge of a cathedral dome, casting it in brilliant gold. You're not alone. Merchants are already unlocking their shutters. Scholars are hurrying to morning lectures, and apprentices are sweeping thresholds clean. This is a Renaissance city stirring to life, and everything from its rhythm to its rituals feels subtly changed from the world that came before. There's a quiet confidence here, a sense that the future isn't merely something to fear or endure, but something to shape. You pass by a sculptor's studio where marble dust dances in the air like mist. The artist is not carving a saint, not this time. It's a portrait of a living man, a merchant, wrinkles and all. He paid for it himself to mark his role in the world. In the Middle Ages, only the most exalted were immortalized in stone. In the Renaissance, the very idea of legacy has expanded. Now people want to be remembered for their individuality, not just their virtue. This celebration of the self permeates every corner of Renaissance life. You step into a quiet chapel and kneel. The walls are covered in frescoes, but instead of stark scenes of judgment or damnation, they're filled with light. Madonnas who smile gently, angels who lean in tenderly, saints with eyes full of human longing. These are not just religious figures, they're relatable ones. This is how Renaissance art works now. It doesn't just lift your soul, it mirrors it. When you step back outside, the noise has grown. Not the chaos of a medieval market, but the buzz of movement, speech, purpose. You hear teachers quoting Cicero. You see students sketching buildings in perspective. Even the architecture feels alive. Arches curve with intention. Columns echo balance and symmetry. Everything is measured, proportioned, not just to glorify God, but to honor reason. And at the heart of it all, man as the measure of things. You walk through the courtyard of a noble villa and notice a small group seated in the shade reading aloud from a handwritten letter by someone long dead, Seneca perhaps. But the words resonate now. Because Renaissance thinkers don't just study antiquity, they revive it. They pull the bones of old Rome and Athens into the modern day, not to mimic the ancients, but to dialogue with them. And in that dialogue, something new is born. Science, for example, no longer hides in the shadows of dogma. It steps forward boldly, methodically. You sit in on a gathering where a physician demonstrates how the blood circulates, not as a guess, not as inherited wisdom, but as observable fact. Anatomists draw the inner organs. Astronomers chart the stars. Mathematicians describe motion with precision. They aren't just marveling, they're testing. This age prizes the empirical, and this method of questioning spreads beyond science. You pass by a group of writers discussing politics, not in whispers, but in open argument. One of them references Machiavelli, who dared to suggest that power need not be moral to be effective. The others agree or disagree, but none are shocked. They've grown used to the Renaissance's great game provocation with purpose. Everything is examined now: kingship, citizenship, leadership. The idea of governance itself is being dissected like a cadaver. And while most Renaissance states remain monarchies or oligarchies, the notion of republic is no longer a dusty Roman concept. it has become an option. That's the power of the age possibility. Even in love, the change is evident. You walk past a poet composing sonnets not about God or martyrdom, but about heartbreak, jealousy, longing. These poems are raw, human, real. Petrarch's verses to Laura echo everywhere. Emotion has entered literature not as moral lesson, but as experience. The Renaissance understands that the soul has shades, not just categories. You continue through a print shop and notice something else entirely, a pamphlet written by a woman. Anonymous, yes, but unmistakably female in voice. It argues for women's education, for recognition beyond motherhood. The Renaissance has not brought equality, but it has opened a crack, and through that crack comes light. You finish your day seated at a long table lit by oil lamps surrounded by thinkers and dreamers. Some are discussing astronomy, others the ethics of war. One man recites a line from Virgil, another quotes Montaigne. Wine is poured. Laughter erupts, arguments flare and cool. This is not a royal court, not a monastery. This is a salon, a place where thought is social, where wit is valued, where intellect is currency, and where ideas can take root over a shared loaf of breasts and a late-night dispute about fate. You realize something: the Renaissance hasn't just transformed buildings and books. It's transformed conversation. It has made thought not just sacred or secret, but public. And that more than anything else ensures its survival. Because once an idea is spoken, shared, and debated, it cannot be unmade. You walk home beneath the moonlit sky. The stars no longer feel so distant. They are points to be plotted, paths to be followed. The very ceiling of the universe feels a little lower, a little closer, a little more yours. You have walked through a world awakening to itself. And the best part: the Renaissance is still unfolding. There's more. Come with me. The sun is setting now as you stroll through a quiet garden in Padua. The day's heat softens and the air carries the scent of rosemary and ink, a curious mix, but perfectly Renaissance. A student nearby closes a book, its pages crinkled and smudged with notes. Not scripture, not law, but something else, philosophy maybe. A dialogue between minds separated by centuries, joined by curiosity. That's where we are now. At the end of an era that is not an ending, but a threshold. You pause beside a fountain and watch as water spills over sculpted stone. You've walked through cathedrals and print shops, through lecture halls and private salons. You've seen divine icons give way to portraiture. You've seen knowledge once guarded now passed from hand to hand like warm bread. And above all, you've seen the human being, fallible, passionate, hungry for meaning, rise to the center of the stage. The Renaissance never fully erased the medieval world. Its cathedrals still stand. Its rituals still echo. But it reshaped the soul of Europe piece by piece. Not with a revolution, but with a reckoning, a rebalancing, a choice to ask more, seek more, be more. And for all its glory, it was not pure. With art came vanity. With knowledge came conquest. With curiosity came colonial ambition. The printing press that spread humanist thought also spread propaganda. The same hands that painted the Sistine Chapel helped fund expeditions that would enslave and devastate others. That's the truth of the Renaissance. Not a golden age, a complex age, a messy, vibrant, deeply human one. You pass an open window. Inside, a woman is reading aloud by lamplight. Her voice is soft, but her words are sharp, perhaps a poem, perhaps a letter. She's not a muse. She's a mind. And her presence is part of the new world taking root. One where voices multiply, where identity is not a script, but a sentence in progress. You reach a bridge and stand at its center, watching the last light fall over domes, towers, cloisters. The view is breathtaking, but you no longer see it as a passive witness. You see it as a participant. Because that's what the Renaissance gave you, quietly, steadily, across every fresco, every essay, every law code and lute song permission. Permission to wonder, to question, to contradict. To imagine yourself as both created and creative. And just as the medieval world placed man beneath the stars, the Renaissance places him among them. Not as a master, not as a god, but as a thinker, a builder, a bearer of responsibility. You step down from the bridge and head home under that same starlit sky. The lamps flicker beside doorways. Voices fade into courtyards. Somewhere a press rolls on. Somewhere a painter puts the final brushstroke on a canvas that will outlive him. And you carry it with you now, not just knowledge, but perspective. You know what came before. You've walked its streets. You've heard its arguments. You've stood still while the world changed around you. That change never stopped. And that, more than any monument or manuscript, is the lasting difference between the medieval and the Renaissance. The former told you your place. The latter invites you to find it. So rest now. We've reached the edge of the age. Let's wind down together. You're lying in a soft bed now, the world of frescoes and philosophy gently fading into the quiet hum of your room. The candles have gone out. The parchment has been rolled away. The city streets are silent. All that remains is the echo of what you've seen, what you've learned, what you've walked through. The journey from medieval to Renaissance wasn't just about facts and figures. It was about feeling. The shift from certainty to curiosity, from rigid hierarchy to layered identity, from fearing the unknown to pursuing it. And tonight, you were part of that. You stood in the workshop with Leonardo. You held the first printed book in your hands. You sat in a candlelit lecture and listened as a new idea broke centuries of silence. You felt what it was like to see yourself not as a sinner kneeling beneath stained glass, but as a soul illuminated from within. You don't have to remember every name, not every theory, not every date. Just remember the feeling of doors opening, of questions forming, of the world growing wider and closer at once. Let your breath slow now. Let your mind settle like ink drying on a final page. The Renaissance is behind us for now, resting in layers of marble and manuscript. But it left the light on for you.